My name is Peachey. I am a former president of the Australian Indigenous Doctors Association, a former president of the Pacific Region Indigenous Doctors Congress, and a former medical educator for the Mount Isa Centre for Rural and Remote Health. I am very aware that a number of community people in the Northern Territory have been supporters of the intervention and are tired of comments from the emerging black middle class about what many would consider to be the business of the Aboriginal people of the Northern Territory. Nevertheless, being that we are now in our 110th year of being a bicameral monarchical federation of states, what happens in one section of our Commonwealth necessarily has influence over what becomes allowable in the rest of the country. I have no direct experience of whether the communities are better off today in the Northern Territory than they were prior to the intervention. I am, however, aware of a number of very critical reports which have painted a less than successful picture. My concerns about the intervention could largely be settled with the answer to two relatively simple questions. Question number one. If it was necessary to suspend the Racial Discrimination Act in order to bring an intervention into the Northern Territory, which was designed to help a specific racial group, what was wrong with the Racial Discrimination Act of 1975 in the first place? And what did the Howard government do, and what is the Rudd government now doing to rectify the intrinsic errors in that legislation so that we can provide a fair and egalitarian Commonwealth for all who live in it? If, as I suspect, the answer to this question is that the federal authorities have done nothing to rewrite this piece of legislation, then in my mind I can only see a small number of possibilities. A. The Act has not been improved because it is not broken, and the authorities needed to suspend perfectly good legislation because they needed legal permission to carry out unconscionable behaviour. Option B. The legislation is broken, but neither Prime Minister Howard or Rudd, or for that matter Minister Brough or Macklin, could be bothered to fix the obviously broken legislation because they don't really care. Option C. This legislation is broken, but their cowardice does not allow them to have the public conversation that is necessary to talk through the issues with the various invested parties throughout the country. I'm aware that the Parliament will soon debate amendments to the Northern Territory National Emergency Response Act 2007, which is due to sunset in 2012, but still no conversation at all about the Racial Discrimination Act of 1975, which allegedly needed suspension in order to do the right and proper thing. Question number two. Did Prime Minister Howard, a law graduate, actually understand what the word emergency meant at the time that he and Minister Brough used that word in the title of their 2007 legislation? The phonetic correlation between the two words emergent and emergency are not some form of linguistic convergent evolution, but is rather best described as etymological. In order for something to constitute an emergency, it must by nature be emergent. That is, it has just cropped up. We could not have seen it coming. There was no warning. This thing just came out of the blue. Now, when Senator Ian MacDonald gave his speech at the time of the second reading of the Northern Territory National Emergency Response Act 2007 in the Senate, he concluded his speech telling us, and I quote, "After 30 years of inactivity, we as Australians are at last doing something concrete and positive to address the problem we have all known about, but have never had the fortitude to deal with." In which case, Senator MacDonald, it was not appropriate to use the word emergency if you have known about the problem for the last 30 years. The fact that Prime Minister Howard used the word emergency instead of a more correct word like maybe disgrace leads me to one of only a few conclusions. First conclusion, in spite of being a successful graduate of the University of Sydney School of Law, Prime Minister Howard did not have sufficient expertise with the English language, leading him to use an entirely inappropriate word in naming the Northern Territory National Emergency Response Act 2007. Needless to say, I find this explanation just a little thin. My other option, being an extremely erudite and accomplished scholar, solicitor and politician, the Prime Minister, with purpose, used an erroneous word in his legislation so as to better hide the real intentions. Of course, I refer to Alexander Downer's admission on the ABC Insiders program on the Sunday following the 2007 federal election, that they'd hoped the intervention would give them a bump in the polls. If anybody can help me with good answers to these two very simple questions, I would be eager to read your comments. Thank you very much for your time.